What's all the fuss about intangible assets? Well, of course, a dynamic capability is an intangible asset. It's not something you can go to the company's balance sheet and see dynamic capabilities listed there, as you well know. But more importantly, behind the scenes, dynamic capabilities is about stressing the importance of intangible assets to management and to valuation. And this, as I said in the very first class, understanding dynamic capabilities, requires you to some extent to understand intangible assets. If you understand intangible assets and dynamic capabilities, not only will you be a better manager, hopefully, but you'll also be a better investor. I want to say investor, an investor both wearing your hat as the CEO, whatever it is you're going to be, somebody inside the enterprise, but also, quite frankly, as an investor in stocks and bonds. And we ended the last class by talking at some length, or at least during the last part of the last class, that Morgan Stanley paper, which is saying, hey, look, everybody, intangibles are the new currency that we have to be considering here. Now, of course, this has been true for 30 to 40 years, and on one hand, I'm delighted that Morgan Stanley's figuring this out now. The bigger question is, why did it take 30 to 40 years before investors started to think this way? Well, the answer is, of course, that they have been thinking this way, even if it's not been crystallized around intangibles. And we're all misled by accounting systems that, quite frankly, are over 100 years old. The way we do our books, well, not too different from the way the Medicis did them back in, and during the Renaissance. That's where double entry bookkeeping got started, a great innovation, but that was 400 years ago. And as my colleague Baruch Lev at NYU points out, there's really not a lot of difference between the accounting we do today and what we did 100 years ago. But the economy has changed dramatically, and we're using industrial age accounting for knowledge age financial reporting. And the only reason for that, of course, is convenience. It's hard to measure intangibles, and we all like numbers. We all like to be concrete, and we think we're being more precise, but in fact, we're actually making huge mistakes. So hence the emphasis on intangibles. And I want to spend the first half hour or so just reminding you how unimportant earnings and even cash flow have become to valuation. I mean, you all know this because you've seen Tesla stock go through the roof and a number of other things happening, and half the population is saying this is just crazy speculation. But another story is it's not all that crazy because, earnings and cash flow are not good proxies for value in the technology space. That's the alternative hypothesis. So either the investors are wrong or the accountants are wrong. And I'll let you pick. Or maybe they're both wrong. So just as a way to finish, not so much to finish up this discussion of intangibles, because it'll take us a while to completely finish it up. In fact, the whole course will be indirectly referring to intangibles. I want to give you a few charts here that actually are not in the course readings, but are in a book by Baruch Lev, who, by the way, was a Berkeley professor here for many years. He got the bug about intangibles and innovation from all the work we were doing on the Berkeley faculty, and he's gone off to NYU. And he has been, as an accounting professor, he has been beating the drum on the importance of innovation, intangibles, and he doesn't quite get to dynamic capabilities, but I assure you that sooner or later he will. At least I hope that sooner or later he will. So let's go to the first slide from his book. And this is Baruch Lev's position. He said earnings no longer move markets as they used to. So earnings or cash flow, he's got both earnings and cash flow here. And on the vertical axis, it's above market returns. So, when we get information about cash flow and earnings, what moves markets? Well, it used to be that earnings mattered through to about, well, when I say it mattered, they were pretty important up through the late 90s. Cash flow was less important. It didn't move markets as much as earnings. So, that's one observation. The other observation is that over time, whether it's earnings or cash flow, you notice this line is going down. And at the end there, it's around 20% for both earnings and cash flow. So it tells you, and wearing your investor hat or your management hat, this is highly important information. Earnings and cash flow don't have a heck of a lot to do with valuation. And we're not talking about, the bubble times or anything like that. This chart ends at 2013. You do notice that earnings were less important during the financial crisis of 08, 09. Cash was a little more important then. That makes all the sense in the world. But take this seriously. Accounting measures of economic performance, of financial accounting measures are not as important. And why not? Well, behind the story, I think, is dynamic capabilities and intangible assets. They don't really capture that very well at all. And there's a number of other slides which make the same point. Here's another interesting one. This is a correlation. That's what an R squared is. You'll know that by now. Regression of corporate market value on reported earnings and book value. And look at that steady march downwards. I mean, if I was an accounting professor, I think I'd hang up my hat and go home, because this is really saying that all the resources that go into financial accounting not particularly useful for valuation purposes anymore. And that is very dramatic, but in my mind, that's a move from the industrial economy to the knowledge economy. And, our mental models have got to change to accommodate this. And the accountants are going to be the last to move for obvious reasons. Here's a similar one, adjusted R squared for market value on reported earnings, same time period, same march downwards. So here's a comment that I kind of drew from looking at this work. Earnings is, if you go back to the lemonade stand, you look at cash for what's determining the value of the stock. And then we thought we got more sophisticated by calculating earnings and bringing in depreciation and things like that. And so earnings were supposed to improve upon cash flow as a predictor of stock prices. But today, actually, cash flow is better, but it's still not the answer. So, most modern financial analysts, Wall Street guys will puff their chests out and say, well, they're really smart. They've learned that earnings are not particularly predictive anymore. So cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. And yes, cash flow matters, don't get me wrong, but there's something bigger going on that is not captured by cash flow. Otherwise, Netflix or even Amazon for that matter, or Tesla or SpaceX would be valued differently. So this is what Baruch Lev makes of this, and he has a dramatic title to this book published back in 2016, The End of Accounting. And he says, in recent years, basic investment decision on the predictions of corporate earnings lost its edge. It's time to look to new approaches. But what are the new approaches? Well, actually, back in '89, a very, very thoughtful professor, I think he's still alive at Carnegie Mellon, by the name of Ejiri, and he was a colleague of Nobel laureate Herbert Simon and James March, proposed triple entry bookkeeping. And I suggest to you, if you buy into the dynamic capabilities story in any way, you maybe want to take this seriously, although I don't think he got the formulation quite right. He says that triple entry bookkeeping would also look at measures of acceleration and momentum of operations and look at the rate of pace of sales, expenses, and earnings. Well, I think actually companies do look at those, but once again, it doesn't get you very far. And so triple entry bookkeeping was never adopted, wasn't much serious discussion about it, but it indicates even back there in the late 80s, very thoughtful thought leaders in the accounting profession were saying, we need something beyond double entry bookkeeping. And the reason we do is because the nature of competition and the basis of competitive advantage and the valuation of firms is different in the knowledge economy than it is in the industrial economy. So let me just pause there. That's sort of, if you will, the end for the meantime of the discussion of intangibles. And I'm curious to see if you have any questions before we move on to discuss some other underlying concepts that are important for the overall, mental apparatus you need to really understand dynamic capabilities. So, Ian, let's see if we got any questions. And I think students can use audio if they want too.
It looks like no questions in the chat yet, but questions are welcome either by chat or live.
Hey, Professor Teece. This is David Holm. I'm a test engineering manager at a small battery startup called Qbird, actually over in Emeryville, so I just came from your neck of the woods. I was just wondering, so like the idea behind this triple entry bookkeeping is the thought that, companies could use, something like this on the balance sheet to secure financing and almost use it as an asset.
Well, yes, it would be a more accurate measure, and a little company like the one you're working on would have a more robust balance sheet. I mean, most startup companies have balance sheets that stink. Now, venture capitalists know well enough, they don't pay much attention to it. But, when you're dealing with a banker, they sure as heck do. Of course, they're looking for collateral. But, unsophisticated minds are turned off by negative numbers on balance sheets. But almost all great companies at some time or another have a negative number. And if you're afraid of putting a company into a negative position, you'll never make the investments needed for the future. So, people informally talk through what the company's assets really are. But I think if you had even if it was just a schematic and a set of questions to ask about what the balance sheet of the company really is, I mean, to build on your point, I remember here with the Berkeley Research Group, my little company here, we've essentially bootstrapped it, but we needed a bit of private equity capital at one point, and we did get 60 odd million. And I went around and met with probably 20 or 30 private equity firms. And, because it wasn't a large amount of money, you wouldn't necessarily get the most experienced people talking or asking questions. But at the end, I'd always, because most of them are MBAs from Chicago and Northwestern and places like that, I'd say, would you like to know the questions you should have asked me that you didn't? And they'd always look at me somewhat whimsically. And then I would tell them, look, you do not understand. I wouldn't advise you to invest in the company because you don't understand it. You've not asked one question, which goes to the foundation of why the company is different and better and what its source of competitive advantages. And they're asking all these balance sheet and income statement questions, which is, I've done road shows as well for IPOs, and you get the dumbest questions. When I say dumb, they're good textbook questions, somebody who's got an MBA from a good school, and they know financial accounting, but they don't really understand the foundations of wealth and value and robustness. So the venture capitalists clearly get closer to it. They have to, or they wouldn't survive. But there's a lot of illiteracy amongst well-trained financial analysts about value because they can't see the forest for the trees. I've seen it, and you've probably seen it. I'm thinking actually it would be a great little exercise for you. Someone might want to write a paper on this since you're looking for paper topics, is to think about what would this triple entry bookkeeping look like. As Baruch Lev points out, nobody took this proposal seriously. But, that was the accounting profession. Nobody from Silicon Valley was probably thinking about it very hard. But it would be a nice term project to think about. Is there, even if it's not some crisp numbers, are there a set of metrics and questions that you should ask that will go to questions about value? So, great question, and there's unfinished business here for sure. Any other questions? Yeah, thank you. By the way, I've got a couple of battery companies myself that I'm an angel investor in, so I'd love to swap notes with you. One of them's here and one of them's in the Front Range.
That sounds like a plan.
Other
Okay. We have
questions?
another question.
Looks like there aren't any raised hands or questions in chat. So if anyone has anything.
All right. By the way, I'm going to start putting a few questions to some of you. I'll give you a heads up about it the day before, not the day before or sometime before class, because I want to try and get some interaction going on this medium. I appreciate, David, you asking a question, but I will, I'll plant a few questions with you so that I will call on you, not without notice, so don't fret too much. And we'll try and get a little bit more dialogue going because I don't want to just be talking at you. I want to try and have a conversation here if at all possible. So let me move on now, and I just want to drive home and be quite crisp about some of these underlying concepts. These are the sort of questions you'll get on a midterm when I say, give me a paragraph on something. We need a new language. I've been saying essentially that most strategy folks are using the language of the industrial economy, and we need the language of the new economy, of the knowledge economy. And there's a whole set of different concepts that we need to be facile with. And the reason, by the way, I'm making it a closed book exam, I know you can all look all of this stuff up, but I want you to have at least 20 or 30 different concepts, maybe 40 or 50, I'll call them knowledge economy concepts in your mind that you have deeply embedded in there and that you have instant recall on so that you can have a conversation with yourselves, with other people in Silicon Valley, with other people that are interested in understanding innovation and how you build and manage new enterprises. So just to summarize our discussion on intangible assets, here is my definition. Intangible assets are identifiable non-financial elements of the enterprise productive resources that lack the material substance of physical assets. In some sense, if you can't feel it and touch it, if you can feel it and touch it as physical, if it's intangible but still an asset, if it potentially generates value, then it's an asset, and it can be everything from intellectual property to relationship capital to know-how that's not protectable by intellectual property, to brands. So, the slang in Silicon Valley is people talk about IP, or I've got some IP here. The slang in Silicon Valley for IP really is a close proxy for intangible assets, because they're not thinking of the legal mechanisms of protection when they use that slang. But to me, when you say IP, intellectual property, I take it seriously. So in this class, intellectual property means exactly that. It means trade secret, patents, trademarks, copyrights, or one of the instruments of legal protection. So we go on here to explain that intangible assets are economically significant assets. Ownership and control can allow you to build competitive advantage. Sometimes you can sell them, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can license them, sometimes you can't. But since you can't eat them, to generate value, you typically have to combine them with something else. A bit amorphous, and that's of course why they're difficult for the accountants. Accountants don't like anything that's amorphous. They want things with precise edges, and intangible assets don't have precise edges. And so the tendency is to, well, let's just ignore it rather than deal with a bit of ambiguity. Let me talk about a different concept of knowledge here. And this is all purely definitional. We usually think of knowledge as being positive, something that's good, something you know that something works, and that's sort of positive knowledge. I know how to build an airplane, positive knowledge, but sometimes you know how not to build an airplane too, and I'll call that negative knowledge, and the negative knowledge actually has value sometimes because it can prevent you from going down the wrong path. So if you don't know that something doesn't work, you might spend a lot of time trying to make it work. And yes, maybe you're doing it differently from what somebody else did, but you don't want to go down the same path that somebody else has gone down unless you're confident they didn't go down it the right way. So negative knowledge is knowledge about things that don't work, and it's quite valuable. That's the paradox. So I just simply put it out there and essentially say that negative knowledge can actually assist learning about actions and paths to avoid. Now, another part of your vocabulary is to think about different types of innovation. And this is a distinction that I've made that other people have picked up on. I'm going to toggle back and forth between something I call autonomous innovation and something I call systemic innovation. And it matters because the way you organize to do one versus the other is very different. So managing autonomous innovation is a different job than managing systemic innovation. So we define an autonomous innovation as one that's part of a system, but which can be commercialized without requiring adjustment or innovation by the other complementary products or to the other complementary products. So I introduced this in passing last time or the time before. Think about an automobile. Most of the so-called innovations many of the innovations, probably true on just about any product, are autonomous. Like, for instance, the self-starter. it's sort of autonomous in the sense that, you have a car that you can start with a crank handle, and I don't know, how many in this class have started an internal combustion engine with a crank handle? If there's somebody, I want them to identify themselves. But before self-starters, most cars with the Model T forward, the Model A forward, did not have self-starter. Maybe towards the end, the Model A forward and later models had a self-starter, but you would have to start an engine by actually getting a crank handle, putting it in the front and the flywheel, and actually turning the motor over. And if you didn't hold the crank handle the right way and the motor started, then you could easily break a hand or at least a finger. So it was not something that the feeble could do. It was usually younger folks who would start a car. And in one sense, the self-starter was an autonomous innovation because you didn't have to change the car very much, except for one thing. You needed now to have a battery. Before the self-starter, it was sort of optional whether you had a battery, because if you got the engine turning over, the magneto could develop a charge for the motor and you could have the generator running it. So you needed a battery, but some cars already had batteries, so it wasn't a big deal. So that's an autonomous innovation. Another autonomous innovation was disc brakes. Didn't really change very much to put disc brakes on. In fact, today you can take if you got an old car and it's got drum brakes, you can take it to a brake shop and say, please get rid of these and put in disc brakes. And it'll cost quite a bit of money, but it's doable. So anytime you can commercialize an innovation without changing the whole system, it's clearly a plus. It's much easier to commercialize that innovation. But at the same time, so that's an autonomous innovation. Let's talk about a systemic one. Systemic innovation is one that requires, if you alter one part of the system, then you have to change the whole system. And needless to say, if you've got an innovation, the adoption hurdle goes through the roof if you've got to change the whole system in order to make it work. So, the automobile itself was a systemic innovation. It replaced, the horse and cart. I'm just trying to think, many innovations that are systemic. Let's see. Well, let me put the question to you. Let's come up with some more examples. Well, actually, I'll give you the best example that comes to mind as systemic innovation is containerization. Think about containerization. It was actually invented by, I forget the name of this guy in Texas who took an old oil tanker and converted it to a container ship. He had to come up with standards, and needless to say, he had to have trucks that would carry the containers that were sized the right way, trucks to deliver the container to the ship, and trucks to take the containers off the ship, and cranes to lift the containers off the ship. Though the cranes didn't have to be modified very much, but you needed standardization. You needed to change for containerization to work. You needed not only to change trucking, you needed to change the railroads, you needed to change shipping, and you needed to do it pretty much on a global basis. So containerization requires innovation in railroads, innovation in trucking, innovation in shipping, and innovation in loading and unloading. And, obviously you can do this somewhat piecemeal. And in fact, that's the way it happened. It started on the Gulf Coast of the United States, and within 20 years, it had gone worldwide. But but clearly containerization requires that you modify a system. And the small containers today were actually the same ones that were developed and used way back in the 50s when this got started. I think this pioneer, I forget his name, sold his company for $100 million or something like that, but containerization probably added, 3 percentage points to world growth or to world trade. China today and the rest of the world couldn't benefit from Chinese manufacturing, and China couldn't benefit from the rest of the world as a market if it was not for containerization. So it's probably, when you think about it, amongst the most important innovations of the 20th century. And the companies, to give you a clue where this is going, the companies that actually brought us containerization at scale were companies like Sealand. And the name of the company tells you that, they were both into shipping as well as into land transportation, whether it was by rail or by truck. So it's much easier to drive a systemic innovation if you've got assets in the entirety of the system. So if the footprint of your assets lines up with the footprint of the innovation, you got a better chance of pulling it off. So that's my main point. And so when you have modularization, you've all heard of modularization, you know what that is. When there are standards and there are modules, then in the modules, you can have autonomous innovation, and you get, a whole raft of companies working to improve the system by just working on a particular module. But then when you got to change the whole system, when you need architectural innovation, it's a very, very different game. And then typically it's only large companies that can pull that off. So already I think you see that there's a place for large integrated companies in innovation, particularly when it's systemic innovation. And smaller companies often have difficulties bringing about innovation that's systemic in character. So there are important distinctions I want you to know about. So Ian, where do we go next with the slides? Is that the end of those slides?
Yeah, that's the end.
Okay, so that's just a few definitions. So let me pause here. We could have a discussion about modularization. We could have a discussion about autonomous and systemic innovation. And let me make one final comment. While I've got these in two separate columns, autonomous innovation and systemic, the truth of the matter is that they're connected. So let's go back to let's go back to another automotive innovation. And that is disc brakes. And then I mentioned disc brakes. Just think about power steering. Is power steering an autonomous innovation or a systemic innovation? Does anyone want to, remember before power steering, you drove a car using a steering wheel. So what's different with power steering? Those of you that have driven a vehicle without power steering, maybe you can answer this. I'm sure there's some that have. Is power steering an autonomous or a systemic innovation? Anyone like to have a shot at that question?
I'd say autonomous.
And why do you say autonomous? Was that you, David?
No, it's Dan Andrews. I'm hiding back here.
Hey, great.
I would say autonomous because it doesn't demand the entire system to change. It does have some. I mean, you're going to have belts and pumps and then different tires potentially, and I mean, there's some hydraulic systems that have to be put, but by overall, it doesn't change the entire system. It's more focused on how you're doing the steering. So it's a part of the system.
Yeah, I'd agree, because you can get like a power steering kit and replace your manual steering with a power steering. So it's modular in that way.
Very good answers, because what you both pointed out is that it's substantially autonomous, but it actually leads to certain systemic innovation. Until you had power steering, you couldn't have had radial tires, because radial tires, if you try putting radial tires on a car without power steering, and you really need strong arms to turn it because it's just much harder. So one innovation facilitates the other. And then also the earlier cars, of course, you had a different gear ratio in the steering wheel. You'd have to turn the steering wheel, 20 times to get to full lock or something rather. And particularly with trucks, think about trucks. I mean, you had to be a weightlifter to drive a truck that was loaded heavy on the nose because it just took a lot of effort to turn the steering wheel. So innovation then enabled more weight distribution on the front axle, which enabled trucks to carry more weight because there's usually an axle limit, 10 ton per axle, whatever it is. And you'd have to go light on the front and maybe move the motor back a little bit, unless you had Arnold Schwarzenegger as your truck driver, because it was really hard to turn, and you couldn't go very fast around corners because you'd be spinning very, 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 very hard. So these things, almost every autonomous innovation invites some amount of system change. Which of course, if you're got the autonomous innovation and so forth, then you can sort of anticipate what the complementary innovations are, the things that are going to change, and position yourself for value capture there. So these it's important to understand these things and ask these questions. So autonomous and systemic are not quite as separable as I've suggested, even if they start out that way. Any other comments or any other examples that people want to give me about autonomous and systemic innovations? Well, let's think about online teaching. Is that an autonomous innovation or a systemic innovation? Well, of course, no innovation at all at this time because it's substantially diffused. But what does the Haas School have to do different to do online teaching versus in-class teaching? Is it autonomous, just something to add on, or do we have to change the curriculum because it's online? If so, then has systemic impacts. We have to change the examination system, which we've done. We have to fight harder to make it more interactive. But let's see. Think of this from the dean of the Haas School's perspective, because that's the manager here, or maybe the dean for instruction. What does this change? What does online teaching change in terms of what the dean for instruction has to think about and do?
I think the Haas use case that Professor Teece just uses is very interesting in terms of how you can almost look at early adopters of an innovation as opposed to like the late adopters of an innovation. So there are a lot of professors who've looked to these changes and they've like switched out their curriculums to have like a part online process, and like they've just started running like say shorter classes or what have you, so that like they've actively tried to embrace this. And then there are like a lot of other, I want to say almost late adopters who've sort of gone ahead and tried to do what they've been doing all along. And just to sort of try and tie that back into how this would play out like in real life, I think people are less interested in those sorts of classes and like participation's dropping on those classes. So I mean, if an innovation's here to stay, then like everybody needs to get on board. Otherwise you might end up getting left behind.
Yes, there's a whole bunch of systemic ramifications. So it's much like the power steering example. Yes, it's separate in some sense that you can deliver the same content pretty much the same way if you so choose. But if you choose to do it differently, we've got actually some extra tools we can use that we didn't have before. But there's also the lack of face-to-face until the technology gets there. I mean, maybe next year we'll have, you know, we'll have better technology and virtual reality or something or other to speed things along. Not to speed things along, but to make it more more social and pedagogically better. Anyway, so look, just think about it, and it's really important because, you know, here's another classic example for you. Think about Thomas Edison and the light bulb. You know, the most salient example of innovation people think of in some sense, you know, it's just autonomous, right? You take out one light bulb and the tungsten, he invented the tungsten filament. There were other light bulbs before that, but they didn't have a life of more than 6 or 8 hours or something like that. So he was the first person to develop a long-lasting light bulb. But to make the light bulb work, you needed a whole electricity system. So then Thomas Edison had to go on and first of all, people said, well, this is all well and good, but you can't have electricity in the house because people will get electrocuted. So he had to build a whole city and wire up a whole town and show, well, that's why we got 110 versus 220. That, well, actually, you know, there weren't a lot of deaths from putting electricity in homes. But then you had to develop the generating capability. So he then moved on to do significant innovation in generation, electricity generation. So he did innovation in electricity generation and distribution, and then, you know, got involved with public policy around the debate of whether or not electricity was safe. So just like in the beginning with the automobile, everyone says you can't allow an automobile on the roads because it'll scare horses and frighten horses and frighten people. And in some towns, you were required to have a person walk ahead of a car with a red flag to say there's a car coming. Needless to say, that held back automobiles for quite a while. So with every innovation, there's usually a knock-on effect, and there are systemic ramifications. But, you know, think of LED lights. LED lights really don't require, you know, that's a classic case of an autonomous innovation, because you can just take the old light bulb out and put the new light bulb in. But at the same time, LEDs allow certain other changes too. If you get the whole system using LED lights, then you don't need as much generation capacity and so forth. But there are some things where you can, literally the LED is a good metaphor for it, where you can screw out one light bulb and put in another. And well, at first, you know, they were not dimmable, but now they are. But an LED is more autonomous than it is systemic. But every powerful innovation, you know, has some systemic ramifications. And the managerial implications are very different. Particularly something like LED, you know, you're not putting more demand for electricity, it's actually energy savings. Yes, it's costing more money up front, but it's saving. So, you know, it's an easy sell so long as you can show that over the lifetime, well, as long as one, you can show that over the lifetime is cheaper, and that two, that people will actually take lifetime costs into account. Any other examples people want to throw out of autonomous or systemic innovation?
Yeah, I'll throw one in along the lines of electricity. If you're thinking about electric cars, right? Something like a Tesla could be autonomous innovation, right? This car has been put together. It's, you know, quite an innovation. It still needs to charge somewhere, right? You need to have charging stations.
Well, so you put your finger on the biggest debate of the 21st century, you know, because if you believe it's more autonomous than systemic, you'll buy Ford, General Motors, and everybody. If you believe it's more systemic than autonomous, you'll buy Tesla and so forth. So So, you know, it goes back to the cell phone. What the iPhone was a systemic innovation. Coming back to remember the quote from Steve Elop at Nokia, Apple beat Nokia. The innovation was not a better phone, it was an ecosystem. That's another way of saying it was a systemic innovation because it was instead of putting a computer into a phone, uh, um, they put a phone into a computer, is another way to explain the difference between Apple and Nokia. And likewise, look at Volkswagen, look at GM, look at Nissan. All of these companies trying to move into autonomous cars, they can't keep up with Tesla yet. I mean, they're spending billions upon billions upon billions to do so because actually Elon Musk turned it into a systemic innovation because he designed the whole car around the new technology, around computing. I mean, in the past, cars got more and more computers, way back in the late 70s, you're lucky to find one microprocessor in a car. Today maybe there's 20 or 30, but instead and it's distributed, but what Musk has done is make it all centralized. It's not computers stuffed into a car, it's a car built around a computer. And then becomes a big question of, well, who's going to win in the competitive battle? Is it Apple and Google, or is it going to be, Toyota, General Motors, Ford, Mercedes? This discussion is by no means, a matter of idle curiosity. And what you're seeing now, of course, Apple's going around this discussion this week. They were going to have a hookup with Hyundai because Hyundai were going to make the cars for Apple. Now that is now dropped, but clearly Apple is going to try and seems to want to take the iPhone approach. With the iPhone, it went to Foxconn. With the Apple car, it looks like it's trying to find a partner, but the question is, who wants to partner with Apple? Because if you partner with Apple, you get screwed. I mean, you get all the value is going to go to Apple, is it not? Because here's what, and I've actually heard this from a source inside. You're negotiating with Apple and they say, well, let's suppose I'm Nissan and I'm negotiating with Apple. Whose brand goes on the car? Is it Apple or is it Nissan? Or is it both? If you're Tim Cook, what do you want it to be? If you're the CEO of Nissan or Toyota, what do you want it to be? These are enormously significant questions. And my understanding is the reason why Apple doesn't have a partner yet, it wants a partner, is because its terms are it's going to be the Apple car, which means your trademark, your brand isn't going to be worth anything. Apple's smart enough to know that if it can, it has to build brand here. It can't just provide the technology. To get real value, you got to build brand. That's what Steve Jobs taught Apple. So that's what's going on behind the news headlines with all of these partnerships between Apple and Google and the automotive industry. That's the great negotiation, probably one of the biggest negotiations of the present time that's going on, and it'll shape the future of the industry dramatically. I think I actually distributed an article, did I not, Ian, about Volkswagen, and Volkswagen spent billions having a real hard job trying to stay up with autonomous cars because, they've got a distributed model where the intelligence is in various, when I say the intelligence that's being designed into the car is distributed to many different parts of the car with different ownership inside Volkswagen. And so they have a much harder management challenge trying to get all of that coordinated than Tesla does, with Elon Musk driving it ahead. So Anyone got any observations on this? Is anyone working on autonomous cars in the class or on the line? All right. Well, big questions. I made the mistake. Let me tell you, I got this wrong 30 years ago. I wrote a paper and I was looking at fighter aircraft. If you go back to the Second World War, what was a fighter aircraft? It was what determined what made it great. Let's take the Spitfire. What made it great was, the design of the plane, the fuselage, and the engine. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Actually, also with turbocharger and with gasoline, high-octane gasoline that was invented in the United States, was shipped from Sunnyvale in Philadelphia to the United Kingdom. High-octane fuel enabled the Spitfire to outclimb and outcompete. It was one of several factors that enabled the Spitfires to beat the Messerschmitt 109 and win the Battle of Britain against Nazi Germany. So, what were the value components? The value components were the power plant and the fuselage, and of course the pilot. You look at a modern jet fighter, or even a not so modern one like the Hornet, the F-18 Hornet. What are the critical performance features? It's no longer the fuselage. That's sort of a commodity item. Everybody steals, the Russians have stolen our designs, the Chinese have stolen them too. It's not the fuselage, not even the engines, although to some extent the power plant does matter. It's the avionics. It's all the control systems, the missile guidance systems. 50% of the cost and the value, if not more, of a modern fighter airplane, well, probably more like 60 to 70% is software. So, writing back in the 80s, I saw this trend and I said, well, I think in the future you'll see maybe an IBM fighter, because whoever, is controlling the avionics or contributing to the avionics or got dominance in the avionics, they'll become the assembler, they'll become the systems integrator, and they will, if you will, drive the bus. Well, I was wrong. I don't quite know why I was wrong, other than clearly IBM didn't have the sufficient software skills. But why couldn't? Here's a question for you: will the next generation of fighter airplanes be a Google fighter or an Amazon fighter? I'm not suggesting this. I want you to think about it. You're preparing your minds to grapple with the complex business questions of the future. And this is the kind of thing you have to think about is the innovation that's going to be driving ahead? Is it going to be autonomous or going to be systemic? And if it's systemic, what's the nature of it? If it's software, then it'd be Microsoft Fighter. Think about it. There's a good term paper topic for somebody. And also you can take autonomous vehicles. Who's going to be the winner there? I mean, of course, the debate is that, well, but Tesla doesn't know how to make 1 million cars a year. And if I'm Nissan and Toyota, I can make 1 million cars a year. Tesla, what are they up to now? 70,000 or something like that. It's not easy. But nor is the software easy. So here you have this horse race between developing the software, and also you got batteries in there. Here's a good question. Here's another good question for you. If I'm going to be, dominant in autonomous vehicles, or just say electric vehicles? Do I have to be in the battery business? Elon Musk is. Do I have to be? Nobody making a cell phone is in the battery business, to my knowledge. They might have certain things, but they're usually sourcing batteries from, I think, doesn't Apple get its batteries from, I don't know where, not from Samsung, but these are the types of questions that we have to grapple with to understand how to manage innovation and how to build dynamic capabilities. Any questions before we move on?
Professor, can you speak a little bit to sort of the interplay within one innovation between autonomous and systemic innovation? So the Apple ecosystem is maybe one example where the value is in the ecosystem as a whole, and each piece can be modular. I can upgrade my Mac without having to do anything with my iPhone. At the same time, I can't upgrade a specific piece of the iPhone.
I can't upgrade it with, sorry, repeat that?
Oh, sure. So like the individual pieces of the are not upgradable of the phone itself.
Right, that's right, because this is I circulated a paper on the so-called walled garden. This is sort of the semi-closed or the closed ecosystem. The metaphor walled garden is referring to what Apple has built. And now this, of course, is under antitrust scrutiny because and the Europeans are saying you're charging too much for the App Store and you don't provide enough choice for consumers, and the people doing public policy are saying, well, yeah, I mean, why not let anybody in? Why do you have to take that amount of margin? And why couldn't anybody get into the App Store? Why do you have to have rules? And I think Apple has taken the view, look, they're building an ecosystem. That was Steve Jobs' insight. And they're going to manage the ecosystem. And if they're going to really create a quality experience for the user, they have to be able to do that. Now, of course, Google's come along with Android and said, no, we're going to have an open ecosystem, and anybody can have access to the Android standards. But I think the reason I have an iPhone is because I think it's not just brand. I think it is better because they manage the ecosystem more tightly in a way that, first of all, provides greater security. I mean, the main reason for having an Apple iPhone today, for many people, is security, and Apple is uncompromising about that. And it's harder, I think, for Google with Android to offer the same security because they're not running the same ecosystem the same way. It's a more open ecosystem. So, and then, of course, it's not a 0-1, open versus closed. There's a lot of non-Apple stuff that can get into the ecosystem, but it all has to be Apple approved. And there are non-Apple accoutrements. You don't have to use Apple AirPods. You don't have to use Apple chargers. You can use other people's chargers. So no ecosystem is completely closed. But I'm actually been saying for 40 years that there is benefits to integration and self-supply and whereas sort of the modern populist view is that everything should be open to everybody all the time. In fact, if you look at what the Europeans are doing right now, just last week, they've said that their proposed regulation is that Google has to make all the data that they collect from search available to anybody to let everybody in. So in essence, not only baking open ecosystem, but they're actually trying to put a dagger in the heart of Google. This all comes, in my view, partly from the fact that the Europeans don't have one single major tech company. Why not? Because they don't have an entrepreneurial environment. Their firms are not dynamically capable. There's too much regulation. And so there's not one single large European tech company. It's really quite amazing. So no one is making such radical proposals in the United States. And I'm not saying that there's nothing in the way of regulation that one should think about for Google, but the kind of radical regulation that is being proposed seriously is really remarkable. And were it ever to occur, it would essentially would destroy two things. It would destroy Google in Europe, and it would destroy Europe. That the regulators would take Europe down because no one's going to innovate. No one's going to, what's the point of Apple investing, or what's the point of Google investing in big data and providing data services if everybody can use Google's data? So this is what happens when you got policymakers that don't know a damn thing about innovation, big data, strategy, or business. And we've trained people and put them into governments that don't know a thing. And this is all new. I mean, listen, we've been talking here a lot about people's reading the model of the industrial economy onto the knowledge economy, and astute managers have sort of figured it out, but policy people are just 20 years behind. I mean, it's really quite pathetic. But you folks are going to be on the leading edge by the time you're done with this class, so there's hope for the world. Any other questions?
Professor, I have, go on. Yeah.
Please.
Professor, I have one question in terms of the relationship between systemic innovation, autonomous innovation, and business ecosystems. Would you say that every systemic innovation results in the creation of a new business ecosystem, or impact to an existing business ecosystem, or is there any correlation at all?
It's a very good question. Like electricity led to an ecosystem around electricity, but it was a completely open ecosystem. And there were multiple standards in it. I mean, you had GE, you had Westinghouse in the United States, and European counterparts. Yes, I think the systemic innovation of any magnitude does sort of require an ecosystem, and an ecosystem is required for systemic innovation to work well. Very, very astute question. And by the way, I don't think anybody has really addressed that question in the literature, but they're clearly closely related things. That you can have, I mean, Apple is its own ecosystem at one level, but it's also in a broader ecosystem of mobile phones, right? So they're sub-ecosystems, just like in a forest, you can have different ecosystems. I mean, the Amazon has multiple ecosystems. It's not just one. And I think the same thing in business.
Thank you.
And what is critical for thinking about ecosystem is standards, and whether the standards are open or closed. So let's take mobile phones. All the standards are open, for 4G, 5G, et cetera, because actually we thank the Europeans for this. Europeans set up, well, actually it's all under the United Nations. It's a very complex system of standard setting bodies that come together, where professional engineers work to select the technologies to go into the standard. So a standard is not just a compatibility like 2-pin plug versus 3-pin plug. In the case of cell phones, it's actually thousands of technologies that are brought together so that the system as a whole will work, but it's open. You can, patents, you're allowed to patent as a provider of the technology. You're allowed to provide patented technology, but then you have to agree to license at so-called FRAND rates, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory rates. So that's an open system, and the reason why we've gone from half a dozen, a handful of cell phone providers 25 years ago to 500, 600, 700 is because it's open. And what's happened, of course, in India and China, a whole bunch of additional companies have come in that if you wanted to tomorrow, you could do your own cell phone, and you have access to that standards technology. You supposedly have to take a license for it, but because it's patented, the patent's out there, the standards are published. If you're not of high moral standing, you can just go use it and wait for somebody to knock on your door and say you owe me a license fee. But any good person would of course understand that they should come forward and be a willing licensee. But yes, there are some ecosystems that are very open and some that are very closed. And this is enormously complicated, what we're stepping into. And in fact, one of the class members sent me this very nice paper on, what was it on? Wasn't on open versus closed. It was on, let's see, aggregators versus platforms or something like that, which there's many different ways to slice and dice this enormous complexity of how the modern technology system works. All right, so Ian, do we have additional slides, or are we on to additional material, or where are we in the outline here?
Right, so this is the end of the slide deck for tonight.
Right, so let's on the reading list here, there's a number of other concepts that I've put down that we need to discuss. So I'm going back to page 5, and I'm just going to continue banging away on these building blocks for understanding innovation management, and building blocks for understanding the knowledge economy, whatever you want to call it, or building blocks that you need to understand dynamic capabilities. So we've talked about autonomous innovation, systemic innovation. Another topic I want to talk about is scope, economies, and scope of the enterprise. These are very related things. Everybody knows what economies of scale are, but how many of you have heard of economies of scope? And if so, would someone want to risk defining what economies of scope are and give me an example of economies of scope? And then that'll be task. That's one question. And the second question is, if there are economies of scope, what are the implications for business organization? Does that mean that the scope of the enterprise has to expand, or does it mean something different? So let's start off with scale economy. Can someone define a scale economy for me? And then maybe we have someone else willing to have a shot at defining scope economies. And then maybe a third person to tell me what the business implications or the organizational implications of that are. So who's up for scale economies? Well, this one's so easy. I'm going to give you the definition, but then I want someone to tell me how important it is today. A scale economy is simply as the volume of production or output goes up, the cost goes down. So it's an industrial age concept. That's how the steel industry works. That's how the glass industry works. That's how the cement industry works. You get volume, you almost always get lower costs. That's how petroleum refining works. bigger refinery always more efficient than a smaller one. So almost everybody knows that, and usually it leads to large plants, but not necessarily large firms. You could have a single plant firm or a multi-plant firm. Just because there's economies of scale in refining doesn't mean to say you have to have 500 refineries. You could have just one to capture economies of scale. So that's economies of scale. What are economies of scope? Anyone want to have a shot at that?
Lowering average cost by product diversification.
Say that again, please.
Lowering average cost by product diversification by offering more variety of product.
Yes. So yes, so let's suppose I got two products, blue and red, and I've got a blue product and a red product. If I can make the two together, I get a lower cost. Now, in that case, it really comes from the fact that you get more volume and you just paint one blue and one red at the end of the day. But let's take some examples that are more complicated. If I make ladies' dresses, what about ladies' shoes? Are there likely economies of scope between the two? Let's take manufacturing to begin with. Probably not, right? Because there's really nothing I learned from making shoes that goes into making dresses. So there's not economies of scope in manufacturing. There may be economies of scope in design though, right? Because if I'm designing a dress, maybe I can design shoes to match. And there may be economies of scope in marketing, because if I'm going to sell, I can go out and sell both dresses and shoes. So there's economies of scope, not in the manufacturing, but at least in design and in marketing. So let's go to the next question. If there are economies of scope, does that mean that the scope of the enterprise should be bigger? So what are my choices? Let's suppose that there are economies of scope. Let's suppose it's cheaper to design things together, shoes and dresses, and let's suppose it's cheaper to sell designs and dresses. Does that mean that if I'm going to make dresses, I should also make shoes and vice versa? Well, it's an easy question to ask, but it's actually quite a hard one to answer. I got choices, right? I could, design. Well, first of all, I could maybe bring an independent contractor into my design house. Let's suppose I'm a dressmaker, a dress designer. I don't necessarily have to open a business to design shoes. I can invite somebody else to design shoes to go with my dresses. So I could do it contractually. And likewise, for selling, well, maybe I could contract with someone and say, all right, here's my dresses. You've got shoes that match. I'll contract with you to sell my dresses, and you can contract with me to sell your shoes. So my point is, there are many ways to skin the cat. It's natural, and a lazy mind would think, oh, gee, if there's economies, I've got to do it in-house. But in fact, if there's easy ways to contract, you don't have to do it in-house. So let's scale it up to something of more significance. I can make, I suppose there's some economies in making trucks and buses. Am I likely to want to capture those scope economies contractually, or am I likely to want to do it in-house through diversification? Anyone want to have a shot at that? And what sort of things do you have to take into account? maybe I'll give you a simpler example. Suppose well, I'll give you one that's so easy that it's trivial. There's economies at all levels in making shoes between the left shoe and the right shoe, right? You don't know anyone just selling left shoes. At least I've never run into anyone selling just left shoes. Nor have I run into anyone just selling right shoes. Although there may be some orthopedics places that do. But as a practical matter, left shoes and right shoes are always sold together. But if I've got variety in ice cream, I don't have to make ice cream and gelato. I can contract for somebody to put their gelato next to my ice cream because they're complements and they don't really compete, and it actually increases the sales of both. But the question comes down to really whether you can work with independent people through contracts to get the job done, or whether there's quality issues or other issues that require you to do this all under one roof. So can someone give me an example where there are strong economies of scope, but you don't see it done under one roof? But there's a contractual mechanism for capturing the economies. Well,
And actually, we might have one. Hemant, if you'd like to explain that, maybe.
I just saw the Super Bowl ad on Doritos 3D, and it just came to mind that they're manufacturing Doritos today, and tomorrow they're going to launch Doritos 3D. It's the same ingredients. The shape is a little different, but they're still manufacturing it on the same roof. I'm assuming there's some kind of economies of scope there when they have the same, same food being packaged and sold in different shapes and sizes.
Sorry, Ian, can you repeat that? The audio was a bit bad here. What was the example?
Unmuted. So effectively, varietals of snacks, as in producing,
snacks. Yeah.
exactly, as in producing a different flavor of corn chip through one manufacturing house.
Yeah. Well, look, I think there's hundreds of examples that go both ways, and some often for reasons of brand integrity, people want to do it all under one roof. But increasingly over the years, people have gotten incredibly creative about how to contract out and let other people make the product for you. If you've got good quality control, you don't necessarily have to make the product in order to capture the scope economy. So I'll just leave it with saying that you can go both ways. There's a set of complicated contractual issues that if any of you are interested in, you can read about. In fact, our Nobel laureate at Berkeley, Oliver Williamson, has frameworks that help us understand better when a contractual relationship is likely to break down and when you want to do something in-house. So I'll just leave it that you can go either way. It really depends on the amount of competition. If there's lots of choices of suppliers, then you don't need to do it under one roof. You can contract out, and competitive forces will give you a good result. So that's scope economies.
Right. And actually, there are two interesting points in the chat that should be mentioned. The first is a potential example of economy of scope of Yamaha making both motorcycles and drum kits, both from the same steel production technology. Can you comment on that as an instance or not of scope economies?
Sorry, I don't see it there. I thought the question was not under the same roof. Did I hear it wrong?
It was a few minutes ago. It was at 7:15 from Christian.
I can't see it on my screen, Ian.
I can ask again.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
please.
thanks.
Yeah. So yeah. Hi, my name is Christian. I think I've already introduced myself in a previous lecture, but my question was about Yamaha, who makes both motorcycles and drum kits, and I heard that the metal that they use to actually construct the drum kits, the whole basically what keeps the drums together, and what they use in their motorcycles is actually the same factory. It's made and they're using the same technology. Is that an example of economy of scope or scale?
Was that Yamaha making drum kits, Ian? I didn't. Got
Yeah,
bad
drum kits and motorcycles.
Oh.
Like, is that yeah? So is that scope or scale?
I don't think there's any scope
Thanks.
economy there, other than the noise out of the exhaust. Is similar. Look, the brands often diversify where there's no economies of scope. So you put your finger on the lesson. The lesson here is don't diversify unless there's economies of scope. But if there are economies of scope, you've got a growth through diversification strategy that's available. Now, look, Honda and Yamaha are good at small motors. So yes, you got Yamaha motorcycles, you got Yamaha snowmobiles, you got Yamaha jet skis. That's capturing economies of scope as well as economies of scale. You get both going together because they're particularly between a jet ski and a snowmobile. There are some similarities. Typically single passenger vehicles, and some of the performance features of each. Some of the aerodynamics and hydrodynamics of each are related. So when companies diversify, good diversification to me is when there are strong scope economies. Bad diversification is when you got helter-skelter unrelated businesses, and that's where you get what I call a conglomerate business. A conglomerate business has no economies of scope. In the 1960s in the United States, there was a whole period where diversification took place by companies buying different businesses, and there was no real fundamental economies. It was just sort of a game, a stock appreciation game based probably on misinformation. Today, you don't see that. And what you do see though is with Amazon and with Google, the tech space is these companies have got scope economies that come from big data. So this is where I wanted to go, and you've jogged me to remember why I put this in the curriculum. It is the very essence of big tech competition. Behind it all, and the reason why the competition people don't understand it, they think that Google's in the search business and Amazon's in the online marketing business, but they're not. In one sense they are, of course, but really what these companies have, they're competing against each other because they've got customer data. So, coming back to our basic principles here, there is a common asset for which there's multiple use of that data. It doesn't wear it out. In fact, it makes it better. So you get a sort of a scale economy effect and a scope economy effect, and that's why these companies are doing so well and expanding profitably. But it's not that they don't have competition; they have competition from each other. But they don't have the standard competition, which is usually defined by a market. So let's come back to Michael Porter's industry studies. He'd say, well, look, Amazon's in the online marketing business, and Apple is over here in the phone business, and Google's over here in the search business. And which is the most attractive industry to be in, or most attractive market? Well, actually, dynamic capabilities framework would say these companies are actually all competing with each other, because when you unpeel the onion and get to the core of it, what they've all got is customer data. Or you throw Netflix in the mix too. And then the question is, how do you capture scope economies from that? And you capture scope economies by going into the other guy's business. So all of those companies have got digital assistants, whether it's Google, whether it's Amazon with Alexa, and Apple with Siri, Google with Google. Digital assistants are a clear case of where these scope economies sort of come together, and you get head-to-head competition. So a lot of these concepts, systemic innovation, autonomous innovation, economies of scope, economies of scale, they actually are still relevant for the digital age. And so let me go to another term that we have there in the course outline on page 5, systems integrators. What's a systems integrator? And how important is that today? Well, every manufacturer of a complex product is in one sense a systems integrator. The question is, for competitive advantage, how good are you at it? Apple is a systems integrator. Boeing is a systems integrator. In fact, you might say, well, how much of the airplane does Boeing make today? It outsources the wings to Mitsubishi Industries. The engines are made by Rolls-Royce. The tail is made by somebody else. And Canadians make the tail. What does Boeing do? Well, it designs the airplane, and it's a systems integrator. And the strategic question is, at what point do you lose the game? If you outsource too much of the manufacturing, at what point do you lose the deep competitive advantage? Will Mitsubishi Industries emerge as a competitor against Boeing after, building the wings for the Boeing airplane for so many years? Well, maybe in the fuselage area, Mitsubishi Industries has a benefit, but it doesn't have the avionics, and it doesn't have the systems integration. And systems integration is actually very, very important. It's getting everything to work together. And Boeing's story with the 737 was, about an add-on feature of what they thought was an autonomous innovation or autonomous change turned out to have systemic consequences, and that's why the plane crashed. So to understand the tech world, you've got to understand what systems integration is and who does it and why it's important. Can someone give an example? What about in the trucking industry and the automobile industry? How important is systems integration there? Is General Motors' competitive advantage in systems integration? Is it in design? Is it making engines? Does it have a competitive advantage? What does General Motors have that Tesla doesn't have or can't easily get? How complex is an automobile? Is it a simple product or a complex product? Is it as complex as an iPhone? As complex as an airplane?
And we could, actually, we're a bit over 7:30, so we could think about that over the break and pick that up. in 15 minutes if that works.
A large fleet of trucks that can be interconnected. I don't know if there's something more there, but I think the point is that, yes, fleet management is a systems, well, anybody running a road and rail system is sort of a systems integrator. But the tighter the links, you know, if there's any break in a link, if it causes systems failure, you know, that's when good management really matters. I mean, yes, if your costs may get driven up if you're a transport integrator. If you know, shipments get delayed or something rather, it certainly can impose costs, but it doesn't necessarily cause the system to crash. Anyway, the point here is that systems integration is important, particularly when you have modular systems, or even when you don't have modular systems. Systems integration is a very important function, and it's increasingly software that is the platform that enables systems integration. So we need to bear that in mind too.
Okay. Haven't been able to do it. That's right. But now I can. So this is the first class I've ever signed up for. It's really cool.
I think you're unmuted.
Okay.
All right, there we go. And let's see, so it's 7:34. So should we pick back up in 15 minutes?
Oh, we at the break time? Yeah. Okie doke.
Yeah.
So let's take our 15-minute break, and I look forward to some more questions when we come back, and if not, we'll plow ahead.
Great.
See you soon.
Great.